Namaste, and welcome to our final manthan of our inaugural Sustainable Narratives virtual conference. It is my pleasure to welcome our many viewers, not only in Britain, but around the world, and to welcome our chair for tonight's manthan, Manoj Ladwa. Manoj is the founder of India Inc., a London-based media house focused on advisory services, angel investing, government affairs, and publishing. He has also recently founded iGlobal, which is our media partner for the conference. Tonight, he will be our guide as we explore, can rights be sustainable without a set of duties? For those of you who missed our previous manthans, some background about Vichar Manthan as an organization. Vichar Manthan, or VM for short, is a platform that engages in open dialogue with both game changers and renowned institutions. We examine the issues facing modern society through a Hindu civilizational lens. At Vichar Manthan Sustainable Narratives Conference, we want to explore the stories we have been telling ourselves as a society, stories which shape how we experience ourselves and the world in which we live. These narratives shape the behavior of individuals and institutions alike. We want to examine the most prevalent stories of our time and put them on the dock in the light of sustainability. For more information or to invest in ideas that matter, please click the link in the video description below. Without further ado, I would like to hand you over to our chair, Manoj. Over to you.
Right. Firstly, thank you very much, Nakul, for that kind introduction, and thank you to the Vichar Manthan team for inviting me to chair this session. I recall speaking at a Vichar Manthan event some 25 years ago, so this brings back some very fond memories. And congratulations for the 3 fantastic days I've heard of your discussions. And I'm sure that this panel will not let you down also. The topic is, can rights be sustainable without a set of duties? And in the words of Mahatma Gandhi, no people have risen who thought only of rights. Only those did so who thought of duties. But who defines these duties and rights? Or what defines these duties and rights? How do our attitudes to duties and rights define our communities and our nations? How do we reconcile and balance out ever-increasing individualism and tribalism with globalization and, in most recent years, an increased sense of nationalism? And finally, does any of this really matter? So, without further ado, let me introduce our learned speakers for this session. Professor Lou Marinoff, Professor of Philosophy at the City College of New York. He's the founder of the American Philosophical Practitioners Association and is an international best-selling author. He is a world authority on applying philosophical traditions to problems of everyday life. His books include Plato, Not Prozac, The Middle Way, and On Human Conflict. Welcome, Lou, to this session.
Thank you very much indeed, Manoj, and to VM. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here.
Great. We also have Dr. Aniruddha Rajput, who's a member of the United Nations International Law Commission. He's an eminent international lawyer and chairperson of the drafting committee of the 69th session of the ILC. He has taught international law at the Indian Law Institute, New Delhi, and the National Law University of Delhi. He is an advocate of the Supreme Court of India. Aniruddha, welcome to the panel.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to you for the introduction, and thank you to Vichar Manthan for inviting me. Thank you.
Great to have you. And last but certainly not least, Professor Matthew McManus, Professor of Politics at Whitman College, Washington State, or he soon will be. He's currently in Ottawa. He has authored several books, notably The Rise of Postmodern Conservatism. He has written extensively on a range of topics from liberalism and socialism, mortal enemies or estranged kin, to making human dignity central to international human rights law. Great to have you, Matt, as well on this panel.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm excited to listen to the different panelists.
Excellent. So first and foremost, the rules of engagement for our session. It's 90 minutes, so we've got a great amount of time to really explore the subject and the issues around the subject. I'm going to ask each of our eminent speakers to make some introductory remarks. I may follow that up with a question or two, and then we'll enter into a much broader discussion amongst ourselves, followed by a question and answer session. I'm going to try and leave as much time as possible. I know that in previous sessions across this conference, there has been a tremendous amount of interest with participants and viewers to ask questions. So I want to leave as much time as possible. And then I'll come back to the speakers to make some concluding remarks, and then hand over back to our compares at which are month end. So Lou, over to you first of all. I'm going to ask you the most simplest question. Lou, what is a nation?
All right, Manoj. Firstly, you're asking a philosopher, and we make a living out of turning simple things into unwieldy things and complex things. So let me try to be comprehensible about this. Firstly, a nation is not visible from orbital space, neither are rights for that matter. So when we look at the Earth from a geographic perspective, certainly we see features which later would explain to us why certain nations coalesce and maintain themselves perhaps more easily than others, because geographic features often coincide, not always, but often with the geopolitical ones. So geography gives us a clue about nationhood from some external sense, but it's a fiction. And if you like, if you look at our natural history as a species, then it's the latest emergence of a tendency for tribes to get very large, self-governing, and a nationhood ultimately becomes a kind of totem, one of twin totems, I would say, because religion is also a transnational totem that affects the concept of nationhood in many countries, yes, which are political and theological or theocratic alliances. But in most general terms, one would say that a nation is artificial. It doesn't come from nature, nor do rights, yes, as we'll get to. But it's an entity which often, but not always, is defined by some kind of contiguous landmass. Again, not necessarily, but mostly a contiguous landmass, which has some recognized kind of sovereignty over it, such that certain laws will hold sway, certain languages, certain customs, and a totem rising above it, which is the flag, yes, that everyone on a good day salutes. And that promotes things like patriotism, which can be very wholesome, or indeed could also become, as you said, the last refuge of the scoundrel. So basically, that's a very simple conception of what a nation is, but ultimately it is conceptual.
Okay. Luke, thanks for that. And I just wanted to probe a little further on the one word you used a couple of times, patriotism. And what role does patriotism play in binding citizens of a nation or a community together? And the other question I have with that, and if you can just tie that in, is where does the word nationalism fit in? Because sometimes these words are used interchangeably.
Well, language is very malleable and very elastic. So back to your question about patriotism. Look, these are all complex, extremely complex issues, and I'm not pretending to encapsulate the whole of them in a brief and pointed answer. Yeah. But let me say this to you. It's a kind of binding force of the clan. Again, if we look at natural history, we don't see anything like nations emerging. What we see are tribes, and very importantly, things called dialectical tribes. Through most of our existence on this planet, we were wandering around in mutually hostile, for the most part, hunting-gathering tribes, which were called dialectical for the simple reason that every member of that tribe knew each other on a first name basis. It's not the case in a city anymore. You get into an elevator every morning with a bunch of people who are in your building, in your neighborhood, in your city, in your state, in your country. You don't know any of them on a first name basis. This is how technology has transformed our self-conceptions out of recognition. Yeah. So what we would consider the modern nation state, again, its genesis is debatable. Rights are older things. I hope we'll come on to that. In the ancient world, there were all kinds of examples of rights being accorded before there were nations. There were empires, yes? There were city-states that had grown very powerful and were able to conquer and demand tribute from surrounding peoples. But this wasn't necessarily a nation. For me, really the Napoleonic era marks the emergence of what we would generally acknowledge as the modern nation state. And in the last 2 centuries since Napoleon, we've seen indeed a proliferation of nations, an ongoing and upward proliferation of peoples desiring, presumably, to be self-governed, to be autonomous, according again to a varying set of indigenous conditions, whereas the conceptual part still remains. One example, Poland, which has been partitioned and repartitioned and overrun. And I mean, the history of the Polish people caught between these juggernauts of Prussia, and Russia famously was not a happy one, but they never lost their identity. There was always something about them which enabled them, even when their country was overrun and subjugated by others, they still never lost that conceptual notion of what it meant to be Polish. So it reemerged when political opportunity arose. So I think that, again, I'm defending the concept of a nation as something that's partly conceptual, and patriotism is the love of that concept that one would have of one's nationhood.
I'm going to come back to you on a couple of points later on, Lou. But I want to move on to Aniruddha. So Aniruddha, let's hear a few opening remarks from you.
Thank you very much. I would like to get straight into the title of the topic and look at it in 2 parts. Because I want to address it on the more abstract and the general level first, and then probably get to specific aspects when we get to the Q&A. The first issue that completely or directly falls out of the topic is whether there can be rights without duties at all. That's the first question to ask. And then the second question is such a format sustainable? What we do see is a lot of debate and a lot of discussion, a lot of discourse about rights. That doesn't mean that rights are not important, but what is equally important is whenever there is a discourse of right, there is an interlinked and an inseparable component of obligations or duties. So when somebody is claiming a right, somebody is fundamentally saying that somebody else owes me a duty. So even if we think of rights, we can't think of rights exclusively. Rights exist in a certain setup and they exist in a certain balance where somebody else is possessing a duty which is correlated to a right. The classical case is really of the 2008 financial crisis, when everybody said, well, whatever these big banks are doing is improper. It's a right. They are violating the rights of poor people, middle class people. So that's where the right was coupled with or inseparable with the very concept of duties. So we can't conceive of rights without the existence of duties. So I think that's the first point to keep in mind. And it need not necessarily be combative when it comes to rights. In fact, what comes to my mind is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The very first article says everybody has a human right, human dignity, but it says one has to exist with a sense of brotherhood towards others. Or the other founding human rights instruments do fundamentally speak about the same concept. There can't be a right without a corresponding duty. And then when we are speaking of sustainability, we are in a zone where we are not speaking of ad hoc issues of rights violations or single instances of right violation. We are thinking of a situation where rights can sustain over a longer period of time. And if we want rights to sustain over a longer period of time, which we all want and expect, it has to exist in correspondence with duties. And these duties need not necessarily be imposed on somebody else. Often these duties do come to ourselves as well. And that's where I think the situation that we are in today, in our today's scenario, we end up looking at rights more in a combative sense. It's more like a sword trying to attack. But what we forget in the whole gamut is once we try to look at this debate from a more of a duties perspective, not just while protecting rights or just while looking towards the state, but even when the state looks at individuals, starts looking at from a duty perspective, and vice versa. It automatically removes the confrontational aspect of the right and the obligation of the right and the duty paradigm. So I do think that there is a need of duties, and duties are extremely critical when it comes to making rights sustainable, that is, they sustain over a longer period of time. And these rights and duties are not just towards others. I think there's also an element of how we treat ourselves. If we are not respecting ourselves, where's the question of we respecting others? And there are several levels of how we can look at this right and duties paradigm, from individuals' presence in a social space, in a family space, what Lou was referring to in a nation space, and even at a global space. So I think the answer clearly to the fundamental question which is being posed for this session has to be in the positive. And to end my initial comments, what really comes to my mind is a very classical phrase which is used in jurisprudence, in legal terminologies. It says, my right to move my fist ends where somebody else's nose starts. So although I have a right to move my fist, but I also have an obligation not to hurt somebody's nose. So we really can't think of rights in isolation. It always goes and corresponds with the duties. I think I should stop there for the initial comment.
No, thank you very much, Aniruddha. I wanted to bring this conversation to a contemporary issue that has been exercising the minds of many philosophers and jurisprudence experts, and that is we're understanding this view from, and forgive me for saying this, but from a classical Western perspective. But with the rise of, let's say, China, how do you think the Chinese would be looking at this type of discourse?
That is a very, very pertinent point. How we look at the debate happening or playing out in human rights today is, on the one side, we have the Western countries who are proposing or pushing for an individual-centered rights perspective and in human rights perspective. And what China is trying to propose is a completely collective narrative, where probably there is no space for individuals, not just probably, but certainly no space for individuals. It is, one might assume it to be societal driven, but it is actually not societal driven, but it is a party driven. It's a communist party driven system. But if we are looking at sustainable rights and duties in a long-term basis, we can't go on either binaries. The path lies somewhere in between. And that middle path is where we need to conceptualize rights and duties in the form of a balance and not tilting in either favor. And the moment we see, if there is too much tilt on one side, we see there is backfiring. In fact, if we look at the all so-called genesis of the Western notions of rights, is basically when the states were behaving in an excess manner, when the king was behaving in an excess manner, was not abiding what one could say abiding by his or her duty, there was a reaction in the form of rights. But I think one step forward could be, and that's probably which fits in the broader framework and philosophy of Vichar Manthan, is trying to look at other ancient cultures. And the Indian traditions, especially of the Shastras, is, I think, a very good way of looking at this paradigm. Because what the ancient scholars from India, the makers of the Shastras did, is they didn't emphasize so much on rights. They emphasized on obligations. And in an obligation itself, there was an embedded concept of recognizing and appreciating the right of somebody else. So even if we are in the zone of obligations as such, but still there is a larger component of rights which is accommodated in such a system. The system that we are looking at today, on the one side of the Western system, which tends to be very much combative towards individuals, because individuals have to assert their rights, convert themselves into a tribe or an electoral constituency or a group in order to assert those rights. And on the other hand, we have the Chinese conceptions, which is trying to, in a sense, obliterate individual rights and have exclusively state rights or right of a certain collective. I think we need a path in between. And I do see that in the ancient Shastric tradition, we can gather some aspects of which could inform the way in which we could proceed with rights generally, human rights in particular, in a more sustainable way.
Thank you, Aniruddha, for that follow-up. And I saw Lou nodding away and writing all sorts of notes. So we will come back to some of these interesting points that Aniruddha has made. But now over to Matthew for your opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much again for inviting me here. And I thought this was a very unique opportunity since there are usually two strands to my work. One is analysis of postmodernity or postmodern conservatism, and the other is working on human rights. So what I decided to do for this talk is link the two a little bit. And one of the interesting features of contemporary political discourse is that one might have suspected that human rights as a kind of eminently modernist phenomena, which really came to the fore globally and conceptually in the 1940s, particularly with the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, would become increasingly problematic in a postmodern era where there's declining faith in meta-narratives, particularly universalistic meta-narratives. And of course, there are plenty of academics on the political left and the political right who do take issue, particularly with the liberal and especially neoliberal conception of rights, which became very dominant through the 1980s. But interestingly enough, we haven't seen a widespread rejection of rights discourse generally by worldwide population, even given declining faith in other meta-narratives. And I think Samuel Moyn makes this point very well in his book, The Last Utopia, where he talks about how rights discourse has actually become more and more popular in what we might call the postmodern era. So what's interesting, though, is that rights discourse hasn't followed the liberal path that many people in the 1940s expected it to take. And in particular, there are new conceptions of rights that are being articulated by postmodern conservatives and other nationalist groups, as well as China, as mentioned earlier. And the reason I argue why it is that we haven't seen a decline of faith in rights discourse is perhaps because in an unmoored or untethered period where people feel increasingly unhooked from tradition, a sense of connection to those around us, we feel that rights, particularly rights guaranteed by the state, are one of the last preserves of stability in both a practical and even a kind of transcendental sense. And in these instances, the state or law, which assumes duty to its citizens, becomes a source of stability for many people in an increasingly corroded time period. Now, one of the things that I think is worrying about this development and the tendency to look to the state, and particularly to the nation state, as the arbiter and the protector of rights, is of course that many nationalists tend to understand rights in a distinctively illiberal way. And they juxtapose their conception of rights in this illiberal fashion against cosmopolitan and liberal conceptions. Perhaps a paradigmatic example of this is Viktor Orban in his 2014 speech, where he said that the Hungarian state is going to respect rights from a Christian perspective, but is going to accept them in a illiberal fashion. And we also saw other iterations of this recently. For instance, Donald Trump, during the COVID crisis, indicated that the state was still going to respect the rights of citizens, including protesters, but we have to accept that law and order are necessary for liberty and for respect for other rights to be tenable. And I think that what we need to do in the contemporary era is recognize that turning to the nation state as a guarantor of rights brings with it both risks and advantages. One of the advantages that it brings, and Lou pointed this out, is that people do have legitimate reasons to believe that the nation state should be the primary guarantor of rights, in particular because they have ways of holding national politicians accountable that they don't for international institutions and international actors. And they feel a connection to the nation state that they don't feel to often elitist institutions like the European Union or the United Nations. On the other hand, I think many of us are deeply concerned that these kinds of illiberal conceptions of rights that are coming to the fore lack the kind of universalistic dimensions that are required for any kind of broadly emancipatory conception of rights to have any kind of moral accountability. So what I think that we need to do if we're going to rejuvenate respect for a universal human rights project is engage in a project of renewing support for international institutions through democratizing efforts. And one example that I give in my forthcoming book is that if we wanted to rejuvenate something like the European Union, we should establish more firm chains of democratic legitimation from the bottom up and reduce the sense that many people have that the European Union is an elite-driven project that advances a very neoliberal conception of rights. It's unaccountable to the people at the bottom who want a more nationalist and illiberal set of rights advanced at the expense of these at the cost of these kinds of universals.
Thank you very much, Matt. I want to bring in the concept of social contract, which you've seen in Western liberal democracies, and do you feel, Matthew, that that social contract between the state and citizens is in any way under threat in, let's say, the USA?
I think it certainly is. And it's important to understand the contract carrying tradition in the right way, right? Very few social contract theorists in the Western tradition ever argued that there was an actual social contract that ever emerged, right? It's always a heuristic advice to try to establish different features of political legitimacy that allow us to bring to the fore what we think is most important about a political association, right? And I think if we're talking about the social contract decaying, at least in Western developed states, what we're talking about is the sense on the part of many people that politicians aren't accountable to the demos, right? They're accountable to international interests, particularly moneyed international interests, and people don't want that, right? They feel that the nation state should serve the citizenry. And I think that, again, this is a very legitimate demand for citizens to make, right? What I find problematic is the hyper-nationalist lens that sometimes is used to articulate this kind of demand, which is highly exclusionary, right? We want rights for the citizens, but we also don't want these other people to be in here because they don't belong and we should get rid of them and reestablish the demos in that way, right? So I think when I'm talking about a project of democratic rejuvenation, I'm saying that we do need to make national institutions more accountable to people, but this also needs to be complemented by efforts to rejuvenate support for international institutions by making them more democratically legitimate and accountable to the people that they purport to serve, precisely because we're seeing such a pushback against this right now. And I think these international institutions are necessary to give a cosmopolitan respect for rights that's very necessary to push back against this kind of hyper-nationalist attitude.
Thanks a lot, Matthew. I want to now open the discussion up, and I know Lou's putting his hand up, and there's been some fascinating points being made by each one of you. But before I bring it to an open discussion, I want to throw out a question back to whoever wants to answer it, or if all three of you in your own way can answer it. And I remember something that Lord Canning said, that every nation for itself and God for us all. Now, that was in a different context and a different era, but the question I posed at the beginning about who or what defines duties? Is it God? Is it government? Do we self-regulate? I just want to bottom out your thoughts on how do we define duty?
Well, may I take my turn then? And
yes, of course.
Because I want to reply to the other speakers. I mean, we're already weaving a thread here. You asked me what a nation is to start off, because a nation is going to determine, for the most part, what are the rights and obligations of the people under its sovereign purview at a given moment. But we haven't really discussed what a right is, and maybe it will be helpful. I mean, you all know what a right is, and you have very highly nuanced conceptions. But for the sake of our audience, please understand that generically, it means an entitlement to something. And that can come from several dimensions. It could be a moral entitlement that people feel they have because of their moral beliefs. It could be a legal, and very often devolves to a legal entitlement, which is something that is perhaps guaranteed to them by a given Bill of Rights or a Constitution. It could also be a customary entitlement that people observe owing to their freedom of religious adherence, for example. So there are a number of different kinds of rights that tend to get thrown into one pot. And I think it's useful to think about that. I do strongly agree certainly with Aniruddha, that rights entail obligations and vice versa. And there's no sensible way of treating this in isolation. Rights cannot be exercised in a vacuum. And a little bit like Matthew, but probably somewhat in opposition, maybe, I will also take a social contractarian approach and a libertarian approach. So I'd like to distinguish between positive and negative rights. And I'd also like to discuss this thing called the social contract. But back to Aniruddha for a moment. The issue of globalization is unprecedented and fascinating. Of course, there were global empires, and of course, there were precursors of globalization. But what we're really seeing now is a commingling of formerly pretty much separate cultures, separate traditions, separate conditions, and conceptions of rights. So when globalization commingles people, and you have this emergent phenomenon of multiculturalism, it becomes absolutely impossible at a certain point to say that all cultures are equal and all cultures are equally deserving of respect for whatever it is they want to do because it's their custom to do it. Because if you go down the moral relativist route, which the American left loves to go down, then you end up not being able to draw a bright line in the sand, and you're going to end up justifying atrocities because, of course, everything's relative, yes? If you're not a moral relativist, then you have another difficult challenge, which is how to reconcile conflicting beliefs in the global village so that you respect the autonomy and dignity of persons and of cultures, but how then do you bring them together to live in harmony? And this is a problem we've not yet solved, with all respect due to the United Nations, not even close. Although the UN has done a lot of valuable work, it's also set, fair to say, perhaps counterexamples by some of the chairs of its human rights commissions, who are among the least evidentially based respecters of human rights on the planet. So one has to look at the UN in a rather quizzical light at times, and I'm a huge supporter of international human rights. But let me just say this, they need to be enforced. And if you have rights that cannot be enforced, then they're meaningless. So the example about the US and what COVID is 2 points, and then I'll defer. But the first point is for those who don't like nationalisms, and I certainly don't like what's come out of the Hungarian right, you will note that the nations that were formerly Sovietized, raped, pillaged, looted, and bankrupted by the dismal Soviet empire are the least and last to be absorbing postmodernism. They've had enough of totalitarianism. So they are trying to reassert their more traditional religious and political autonomous rights. What I don't like coming out of Hungary is the anti-Semitism that rears its ugly head. And that's never far behind. Once you start going far enough to the right, you start getting the neo-Nazis coming out of the woodwork. Yeah? This is a horrific prospect. So how can you respect Hungary's sovereignty without condemning its anti-Semitism? I can't do this, you see? So that's one problem. In the US, but let me say this, the COVID epidemic has made all nations circle the wagons. There has never been a more conspicuous reemergence of nationalism than in the wake of this epidemic. Your quote, Manoj, was no more appropriate than to this. Every nation has suddenly had to fend for itself. Every nation has suddenly had to provide healthcare. And no nation can depend on any other. The supply chains, of course, have been impacted too by this. So we've seen nationalism as we've never seen before. And when this epidemic goes away, we'll still have that hangover when we try to restart globalization, okay? But the point I want to make is that rights entail obligations because, again, they cannot be exercised in a vacuum. If you have a right to something which libertarians call a positive right, then there's a duty on the part of others to supply something for that right to be exercised. If you have a right to vote, someone has to supply candidates in a ballot box. Quite simply, if you have a right to freedom of expression, someone has, on what we call a negative right, someone has the duty not to interfere with you. You want to get up on Hyde Park Corner and speak your mind, then others have a duty not to interfere with that. That's called the negative right, yeah? So I think we have both in play, and the social contract may be ill-defined, but it's the very thing, and I'm a Hobbesian on this, an unrepentant Hobbesian. We got out of the state of nature, which was not pleasant, which was not peaceful, which was not Rousseau's noble savage. We got out of a brutal state of nature only by adopting a social contract. And that, in fact, imposes obligations on all of us. If I want my privacy and my liberty and my right to life and property respected, I have to do the same for my neighbor. And the COVID in the US has only deepened the civil war. So you have extremes on both sides. The southern states that were governed by people who believe that liberty means do whatever the hell I want and to heck with everybody else. So they didn't oblige or compel their citizens to wear masks. Now you see the result in some of those states. The left-run states, on the other hand, were very quick to clamp down and actually did a very good job of locking down their states for the most part. But when it came to Black Lives Matter demonstrations, suddenly social distancing was off the table. Suddenly masks were off the table. Okay, if it came to a knee-jerk political cause, Black Votes Matter, if you pardon my cynicism, then all of a sudden those safety measures were abandoned overnight by the same governments that had compelled them. So what we're seeing in the United States is extremism on both sides coming to the fore, enabled by these very tragic, and as the Chinese would say, interesting times in which we live.
Matt, thanks a lot, Lou. And Matthew, you were gently nodding away there. I wasn't quite sure whether that was in agreement or that you were just hearing Lou out. What's your take on what Lou just said?
No, I completely agree with Lou that the state of nature, however it is you want to hypothesize that, is certainly not a desirable situation to be in. And whether or not the state is an artificial construction, as Hobbes would talk about it, it's a very valuable artificial construction and one that we do away with at our own cost, right? And I wanted to point out that I'm certainly not a moral relativist in any way, shape, or form. I think that rights ultimately find their moral grounding in the conception of human dignity. I've sketched out a number of books. I won't bore you with all the details. But I think that when it comes to the question of rights and duties, talking purely from the perspective of political legitimacy, right? Any kind of set of rights that individuals or groups, if you take a multicultural perspective, enjoy, associate with a correlative set of duties on the part of state institutions, right? And I think one of the reasons why you're seeing many people push back against international institutions is, as Lou was pointing out, they don't see international institutions as having the force to actually assume these kind of correlative duties in any kind of meaningful way, right? It's just airy-fairy talk, right? That you find in international documents. Now, I think that that's problematic because I actually support international institutions and cosmopolitanism in a robust sense, but I can't understand why it is that so many people are now returning to the nation state in this Hobbesian sense to say, look, like this is the last set of institutions that we can actually meaningfully influence. We haven't been able to do so for a long time, but we still can. And we want them to assume these kind of correlative duties to us by not just respecting the rights that we have assured to us, but in many cases, people are calling for them to be expanded. For instance, through extending economic rights, for instance, during the COVID crisis, to many different groups of people that have historically been marginalized by neoliberal policies, right? So I think we live, as Lou said, in very interesting times, right? What's going to emerge from that is anyone's guess. I'm certainly not going to try to play a prophet here. But I think that what in my ideal world, we'd see a renewal of democratic accountability, an expansion of rights to the economic sphere, and chains of democratic legitimacy that are established at both the national level and ultimately to the international level, where they've for far too long either non-existed or existed in a very thin fashion. So that's the kind of way I hope we go forward. Whether or not we do is anyone's guess. I've given up trying to predict what's even going to happen by the end of 2020, let alone what's going to happen within the next 10 years, right?
Thanks a lot, Matt. Aniruddha, I want to bring you in here, and specifically on multilateral institutions. And we all know that countries like India have been knocking on the door of membership of the UN Security Council. But I have a deeper question, and that is that are the ideological underpinnings of multilateral institutions like the United Nations fit for purpose in the 21st century? And coming at it from an India perspective and a philosophical perspective, where do you see the reforms that would need to take place at an ideological level for there to be real meaningful understanding of India's positions on world affairs?
Yeah. The first thing to keep in mind is when we have a crisis, we need somebody to bash up, which doesn't solve the problem. Despite its fallings, United Nations has its utility for several smaller states. We tend to look at only from the P5 perspective. UN is not just P5. There are several other member states, smaller member states, who actually thrive and survive simply because UN is there. Now let us acknowledge what exists. So this is what currently exists. Is it sufficient? It's definitely not. It's rather far from it. And now we need to start looking at how we look towards the future. But before we look into the future, we need to look in the history. And the history is the problem with the very manner of creation of the United Nations. It was nothing but a nice conversation which Churchill had with Roosevelt on a nice ship. What we have an Atlantic Charter, agreement between two political leaders. The whole world had to nod to it because India did not exist as a nation state when the United Nations came into existence. Forget India. 2/3 of the world did not exist when the UN Charter came into being. Now, where does the UN stand? The UN is itself in a state of transformation, and it is bound to be. And as always happens, the old guards don't want to let their control go away. And the new emerging powers want to wrestle that away from the existing ones. Now, the ones who want to come up have to decide whether they want to fight too hard and dismantle everything, or be sensible, reasonable, and take a step-by-step approach. And coming from India, I do feel that India has been taking a step-by-step approach. One of the fascinating events at the United Nations, which is not often spoken of, is the Indian candidate defeating the United Kingdom candidate in the elections of the International Court of Justice. And that too, getting that candidate defeated in the Security Council itself. It's a tectonic geopolitical shift, and which has happened in the UN. Is it sufficient? Definitely not. There's far more to happen. And I'm very confident that far more things would happen. It really depends on the trajectory that, and especially I feel one of the greatest credentials of India, it has been a consensus state. And why I say that, because to get elected on the International Law Commission, I had to run a campaign, and I was elected by the General Assembly. And what I felt is there is a great feeling of goodwill among states. And that feeling of goodwill among smaller states, amongst mid-sized states. India may not have distributed as much support systems as other states have done over the years to create and nurture their relationships. But it is that goodwill which has functioned well for India. But now I want to step back a bit and respond to a bit between the exchange between Matthew and Lou about the whole who gives the right, how does it function, how to define the right. And that's where I beg to differ, probably because I come from India and from one of the ancient cultures. I have unflinching faith in goodness of human behavior, although it has been abused and misused and destroyed several times, because that's how I'm brought up with. And why I'm being brought up with? Because that's what scriptures say, that's what is taught in every house. So here we see a very strong impact of ideas being implemented in day-to-day life. They may not be educated as we understand ourselves to be. They may not be as learned, esoteric, as philosophical as we are. But somebody walking on the street seems to be understanding the philosophy of life much better than what we try to understand here. And that's where, of the exchange which was going on between Lou and Matthew, I was thinking to myself, there were two strands of it. First, there was unbelievable discomfort about the goodness of human mind. And that's why we have these artificial theories of nature, of state of nature, that's where humans exist. And we have a great deal of faith in international institutions. So we are trying to have a system where we have a top-down model, where everything is decided by the so-called intelligent people and then thrusted down. Or we think of a system where there is greater participation. And I don't think, as long as nation states are making efforts to make their lot better, not interfering with their rights, there's no harm mere internationalism by itself is not good. Internationalism has to be for a purpose. There has to be a clear goal. If we don't have that goal, then it just becomes a self-entertaining enterprise. And we do see, for example, the UN Charter, the main objective not to have wars. Have we managed to stop? Well, we've just not used the word war, but it is still happening. Look around the world. So I do think that here is the time where we need to pause. We need to step back from our Western perspectives, and I call mine as well as a Western perspective because I've studied and lived there. And we need to look at the ancient traditions, the ancient Hindu tradition, the scriptures, and to look at the way in which this relationship was balanced. And can it function in the modern world? I think if I'm behaving good and expecting others to behave good, I don't think there might be a problem. Yes, there would be initial hiccups. You might fail on some efforts, but in the long term, if we want rights and duties to survive, that's the sustainable perspective that we might have to take.
Lou, do you want to come in here?
Yeah, this is a wonderful conversation. Just let me say, Matthew and I agree more than we disagree, which surprises and pleases me. This is a very good thing. If only you and I, Matthew, were on primetime television, we could help to heal some of the divisions by finding common ground, of which there's a dire absence in the United States and in other parts of the world too. So there's always dialogue solves a lot of problems, believe me, just by bringing people together. Now, Aniruddha, let me tell you something, if I may share with you, that I'm a devotee of Indian philosophy myself. I've been teaching it for more than 20 years at City College, where I founded Asian philosophy courses. I also teach Chinese philosophy, and I am no less fond of Taoism. And I also teach Buddhism, which, strange to say, is the common denominator between India and China. One cannot imagine two more different societies or nations, if you want to call them that, yes? The two greatest of the ancient civilizations that persist into today's world are India and China, and they are knitted together by their philosophy, in my view. Their respective philosophies are the very things that are the glue that have bound their societies so tightly together over centuries of all kinds of fluctuations. And yet they could not be more different. India is the world's largest democracy, the most pluralistic country in the world. Yes, I don't have to tell you what it is, with a scripture that is unlike every other Western scripture because it's open-minded. My favorite quote from Bhagavad Gita is when Lord Sri Krishna says to Arjuna, by whatever path they travel, they come to me at last. There is no scripture in the West that has ever said such a thing. Mostly we're accustomed to the hell, fire, and brimstone warnings that if you don't follow this revealed truth, you're going to burn. India is very open-minded, and there's nothing that's incompatible with Indian philosophy. But yet Buddhism is its greatest export. And many people in the West, now millions of people in Europe and in North America, and in other westernized countries, have turned to Buddhism because they self-identify as spiritual but not religious. And they are fed up with the corruptions of institutionalized religion, which has lost a lot of ground lately, although there's still half the world's people are Abrahamics, one way or another. But Buddhism is having a huge impact. And of course, what the Vedic scholars said when Buddha contradicted the fundamental equation, Atman equals Brahma, and Buddha said Anatman, Ananta, and they said, no, this is contained in the Vedas. The refutation of the Vedas is contained in the Vedas. There's no problem. So only in India do you get this kind of open-mindedness, and I thank you for it. And I think that India will survive postmodernism. India will survive anarchy. India will survive whatever the world offers it. As a great role model, but we need to learn more from you, and I fully agree with that. The problem, though, is that not everybody has this point of view, and that if we respect the autonomy of nations, as we're bound to, according to the UN Charter, and we think of nations as equal, which is a fundamental fallacy woven into the Charter. Nations are not like persons. Nations large and small are not equal in what they can deliver to the global village, what they can demand, and on the impact they can have. So we have to be able to address that. But basically, we want to universalize human rights. And at the same time, we would like to be able to respect differences in religious or political beliefs and not allow them to become the basis of conflict. So that's my message to you. What we ought to have a right to is a right to see human beings as persons fundamentally and as equals in our membership of the human race, and not allow the differences between and among us to become the basis of conflict. And that would be an overarching mission that large institutions like the UN could indeed perhaps pay more attention to.
Yeah.
Luke, sorry, Matthew, you want to come in here?
Yeah. No, I just wanted to say in response to some of the questions, I'm certainly not a pessimist in any meaningful sense. In my more cynical moments, I just think, well, cynicism is just what happens to an optimist when you've been disappointed too often, right? And like our other speakers, I actually largely agree that dialogue can be tremendously important in facilitating respect for rights, particularly by drawing attention to the commonalities that exist between people and between culture, rather than highlighting differences. I just wanted to stress, though, that I think there are two interrelated dangers to turning to dialogue as a solution to all the world's problems, right? One of them is the danger of what's sometimes called superficial cosmopolitanism. And if you want a good example of this, the philosopher Slavoj Žižek sometimes talks about Hollywood Buddhism to reference like Lou's kind of idea, right? You have these people who will study one or two Buddhist texts for a few seconds, integrate it with a highly kind of capitalistic view of the world that's very Western centric, and then they don't really bother to delve that deeply into the subtleties and the intricacies of competing and respecting traditions, right? And I think we see superficial cosmopolitanism in a lot of parts of the world right now, right? Where people don't actually bother to look at the intricacies and the subtleties and the depths of different cultural and philosophical or religious traditions. They just kind of content themselves with the surface, right? The other danger that I see is much more technical, and a couple of people have stressed this, which is how do we dialogue with one another from different cultural perspectives without falling into the pit of cultural relativism, right? Just saying, well, everyone's allowed to dialogue, everyone's perspective is equal. Neo-Nazis have the same kind of cultural value as ancient cultures like India or China or wherever it happens to be. And I'm not sure how to avoid that danger, right? There have been a lot of different policies or proposals put forward for how it is that you can engage in cross-cultural dialogue without falling into cultural relativism. My preferred one is Jürgen Habermas's, but I don't want to get into all the details of that. But I do think it's a substantial danger, right? And we see the consequences of that danger in the American left right now, right? Where there's not really an easy way of accepting different cultures without falling into cultural relativism, even though we do want to dialogue and have respect for the others, since that's extremely important, right? So how to solve that problem? I think we need to have a dialogue about that, right?
Thank you, Matt. I want to bring one other concept into the mix here, and that is the concept of democracy, to the rights and duties debate. And Lou, you so eloquently said that India will survive postmodernism, India will survive anarchism. Will India survive democracy as well? Because remember, Gandhi said, democracy, a good idea, but has it encouraged too much tribalism? And let's take it, in a more global context as well. Is it creating more discord than good? Where do you see this debate going?
What a great question. And I'm sure that our other two panelists have a lot to say about it as well. To begin with, I'm not Indian, although in spirit I am to a large extent. I have many, many friends in India and many friends who are Indian who are expats. And I spend as much time in India as I possibly can, not lately, unfortunately. But let me just say this to you, that if any nation can survive democracy, India can. Remember what Churchill said about it. Democracy, he said, is the worst form of government, except for all the others. So I think democracy is a political experiment. And coming back to something that Aniruddha alluded to, please understand something. Buddhism commutes, not the superficial kind, Matthew, but the more long-lasting kind, the more deep-rooted kind. How does it possibly commute between India, which, remember, Gandhi also said, let self-rule be chaos, let it be anarchy, let's just have self-rule, we'll sort it out. And he was right, ultimately, or at least so far. But India is incredibly pluralistic, incredibly democratic, and I've never met any two Indians who think alike. You have very strong social norms and conventions to which people adhere externally, but internally, I've never seen such freedom of thinking. It's a beautiful thing to behold. China demands conformity and uniformity, but that's not a Chinese thing only. Japan does too, and so does Korea. It's a Confucian thing. Again, their philosophical glue is an authoritarian glue, where duties come before rights and in fact preempt them. In the Confucian system, there are only our duties toward others. There is no such thing as enlightened self-interest. In Japan, they say the nail that sticks up gets hammered down, and no one wants to get hammered down. So everyone adheres regardless of what they may think. China originated this. Confucianism is very strong when it comes to duties and very weak when it comes to rights, but it has great longevity. So that's an interesting lesson. What I find in the West, and to hearken to what Matthew said about the illiberal left, there's an illiberal right too, but the illiberal left basically has become a rights-crazed society where people basically demand a right to everything and a duty to nothing, an obligation to nothing. And moreover, what really concerns me in the West is that people have confused rights with privilege, and this has been a deliberate obscuration. Privileges are earned, and privilege now has become a pejorative. This is part of the leftist agenda to shape language in a certain way to keep people agitated. Nobody has a right to a driver's license. A driver's license is a privilege that you basically earn by demonstrating your competency to operate a motor vehicle. You're not born with a right to drive. And higher education, pardon me for sounding like an elitist, which I am not. Higher education is not a right. It's a privilege, which you demonstrate by being able to perform at a reasonable level in K-12, which is a right, by the way. Yeah. So, I mean, I think one really needs to make this vital distinction between rights and privileges. And we have a lot more rights than we have privileges. Privileges are not necessarily a bad thing. They can be a bad thing when they're motivated on the basis of racism or sexism or other kinds of inherent bias. Then privilege definitely takes on more of a toxic odor. But in general, privileges are something that we earn by virtue of our ability to perform, whether it's a privilege to be playing on professional sports or a privilege to represent your nation's Olympic team or a privilege to be accepted to a PhD program or a privilege to drive a car. Yeah, that's not a right. You have to earn that. And in the West, we've conflated these two concepts.
Aniruddha, do you want to come in
Yes,
here?
surely, yes. Before I come to democracy, I think we need to realize that the very concept of nation state as we understand today is a forced notion on the Indian subcontinent, because it's a Western notion, and it is something which I think that's one of the reasons why it's very difficult to get Indians collected together as a nation state entity. It is much easier to gather them as a social entity, as a religious entity, as an entity bound around customs, rather than a very serious electorate voting, which is certainly now happening. But it has happened over the years. Therefore, the very notion of nation state is a kind of an uncomfortable concept, which now a nation state of India is adjusting to. Therefore, when Louis said that he's an Indian in spirit, one can only be an Indian in spirit. Passport is simply a token, and even if somebody has an Indian passport, doesn't make that him or her Indian. You're Indian by your spirit, not by the form. So we have to. That's one of the problems. But the second bigger issue is of what we've raised: will India survive democracy? It's not about survival of democracy. It's really about democracy being ingrained in the society and in the family. And when we say pluralism, and take any Indian family, within a family, I was explaining to my wife one day, within our family, taken together, we worship some 50 gods. Can you imagine that? Because I myself have 4 or 5 preferred, my parents have their preferred 15, 20. So we worship 50 gods. What more democracy can you imagine? So democracy is fundamentally ingrained in the Indian culture. But the question is of whether that is getting translated effectively in democratic structures and institutions. Because structures and institutions have been forced from the West. They don't belong to here. And that friction is bound to exist till the time the society fully adjusts to it. Well, someone might say, well, it's been 70 years, 100 years. Well, look at the Western democracies. They've been there around for much longer, or they have been having a certain kind of a setup which has existed for much longer. But if we look at it from an overall perspective, there is a strong sense that the society has adjusted to the Western structures because it is fundamentally democratic in nature. But what it struggles with is the centrality of the functioning of the state. So even if we speak of decentralization of governance, the lower level of governance should have more powers, it is still happening from top down. Whereas for an Indian, traditional Indian, it has to happen from bottom to up. So these issues would remain. And I think as India proceeds, which it has proceeded strongly till now and would continue to proceed in the future, despite some disruptions of emergency. In fact, emergency was a good example to show that Indians very strongly said, it doesn't matter, we believe in democracy, authoritarianism has no space in India. So that's something which will guide the country as it goes further and which would eventually translate itself, because in law, all countries are one, everybody has one vote in the General Assembly. But in international relations, which is not the case. So when such a power becomes a consensuous power, it is expected it would percolate that consensuousness of itself into other aspects of international relations and then make a global society a more robust and a more sustainable and a more fairer society.
Okay.
I'd like to there for
a significant number of questions that are coming out from the audience. We'll continue our discussion for a little while and then we'll take some questions as well. I want to bring this conversation, this fascinating conversation, round to the individual. And Lou, again, you know, to refer to something that you said, you talked about the concept of privilege or the attitude of privilege, and that, look, hey, I pay my taxes and therefore I have rights, and then it stops at that. And somehow this transactional relationship that you're seeing, I think, more and more in society, and that's my observation. How do you bring the conversation back, and how do you bring governments, institutions to start thinking about individual responsibility? And how do you make attitudinal changes to individual behaviors to sort of get more of a balance between the rights and the duties? I don't know, Lou, if you want to take that first, and then Matt will come to you.
All right, I'll be brief, and I know Matthew has something to contribute as well to this, but let me just say what I wanted to say to close the last part, and then to answer you, Manoj. Look, democracy is a political experiment. It's not a finished product. It never was. It never will be. It's something the Greeks were courageous enough to experiment with in very ancient times and failed there. A quick ironic story. Do you realize that it was the Greek partisans who caused Hitler's invasion of Russia to be delayed by crucial 6 weeks because he had to pull front rank troops off the line in order to quell the uprisings in Greece? And that delayed Operation Barbarossa. And that, in the end, was the defeat. That was the first irreversible defeat of the Third Reich against the Russians. But do you know the grand irony concealed in that was the Greek government at the time was a government of despots, and they had removed Plato's Republic from the curriculum. The Greeks were not studying Plato, and they weren't studying Freud, and there were a whole lot of other books that might just as well have been banned by the Roman Church that the Greeks weren't allowed to study, and yet they derailed Hitler. So, I mean, history is always more convoluted than the simple facts that we learn. So democracy is an experiment, and it may fail. And I'm sorry to say that authoritarian governments have a much more longevity in history. And maybe for good reason. The enlightened despots are few and far between, yeah? But unfortunately, despotism has a much longer track record. Monarchy has a much longer track record than democracy. The dangers that Polybius warned us about were really three, that in the ancient world they had experimented. Polybius warned us that monarchy, of course, could degenerate into despotism. And that's horrible for everyone concerned. Aristocracy can also degenerate. It can become democracy governed by the wealthy, which we see in the US, or it can become oligarchy, right? You know, basically a sealed club of people who self-perpetuate. Whereas there's nothing wrong with aristocrats who are governed to lead and know how to lead. That's arguably a defensible thing. And democracy, of course, can degenerate into mob rule or anarchy. And if you defund the police, you'll see this happening as we speak. So there are dangers associated with every form of government. And we don't know what the future of democracy will be in India or elsewhere. All right, as far as individual responsibility is concerned, I think on the one hand, I'm a philosopher, you're going to get contradictions from me, all right? I'm very, very strong methodological individualist, a la Popper. I believe that the great events in human history, the great inventions, the scientific theories, the breakthroughs, the vaccines, they're the results of individual insight, revelation, or occasionally a small team working together. But the great things in human history are accomplished by individuals or small groups, not by mobs. Okay, with all due respect to the masses. And so basically, I'm an individualist. On the other hand, enlightened self-interest is a very dangerous chimera because it's arguably a contradiction in terms. Self-interest can never be enlightened and truly self-interested, only in the Taoist sense. Lao Tzu says that the highest form of self-interest is not to be, if the highest for the sage is never self-interested and therefore is the most self-interested of all. So if you're really interested in yourself, don't be self-interested, be interested in others, and yourself will prosper. It's also a fiction, yeah? There is no self. Westerners are wedded to this psychological conception of the self, and the psychologized American mass is wedded to the notion of a healthy ego. It's an oxymoron. The ego is by definition unhealthy. It can never be made healthy. So those are a whole set of other issues. Individual responsibility is nonetheless paramount, and it's group rights and toxic identity politics, which have completely undermined individuality and absolved people of all responsibility. If you wake up in the morning and you look at other people and judge them all and only by their race, class, and gender, which is what the Marxists have done in the US, the ones that have colonized the left, then you basically destroyed individuality and individual responsibility. I'm a transhumanist. I believe that everyone is judged on their merits. I believe what Martin Luther King said in his famous I Had a Dream speech. You remember? He wanted his little children to be judged on the basis of what? On the basis of the content of their characters and not on the color of their skins. And now we have everybody systematically, daily, and hourly judged only by the color of their skins. And this lets you totally off the hook. Oh, so why should I be allowed to commit crimes? Oh, because my great-great-great-grandfather was a slave, therefore I'm I'm exempt from law? No, we were all slaves, my friend. At one time in human history, every one of us, and the people we're descended from were slaves, is not an excuse. If you want to be free, study freedom. That's my message to people. You want to be emancipated, study emancipation. If you want a life of quality, assume responsibility only for the things for which you're responsible, only your state of mind and your character. Those are the things you're responsible for. If you assume responsibility for those things, the world will be a more peaceful and harmonious place. And that's basically how you cure this problem of lack of individual responsibility, by reminding people that they're individuals. At the end of the day, we're all minorities of one.
Right. I can see Aniruddha's itching to come in, but I'm going to ask Matt to come in first and respond to that, and then Aniruddha.
Sure. Well, what I'd like to say is that I think when democracy functions well, and as everyone from Thucydides to Aristotle recognized at the origins of democracy, it doesn't always work well. But what it does, it's the best form of government, bar none. And what I think we need to recognize is that democracy is not just a set of institutions and correlative rights and duties, right? It's also a kind of culture. And democracy functions well when the culture underpinning a democratic society is predicated on what's sometimes referred to as civic friendship, right? We look at other individuals as people who we are invested in, who we see ourselves as having moral obligations towards, and who are part of the same community that we're all trying to work to make better. And I think what you're seeing today is a decline of civic friendship in many, many different Western states. And this is why people are increasingly, when invoking rights, taking a transactional approach to it, right? It's not about my duty towards other people. It's not about trying to advance our democratic cause together. It's about what I can get from other people and from the state, right? And I think when we look at the collapse of civic friendship, we have to try to interrogate why it emerged or why this happened. And I think there are a lot of reasons for this, right? I think one of the reasons is you increasingly saw political institutions removed from the demos and operating in the interests of various forms of elites. And this made people very, very angry, and it made them want to blame someone. I think you've also seen the emergence of new technologies, which make it very, very easy to have a very thin opinion about something and engage in hyper-partisan ruminations or accusations against other people. I think there are also dramatic cultural changes that are removed from democracy but associated with it. For instance, the rise of secularism in many parts of the Western world, which removed the kind of religious ties that many felt together. And I'm not sure what the right answer is to try to restore civic friendship given these kinds of pressures. I think one thing that we could do is try to democratize more forms of civic life. I think that what we also need to do is look at a renewal of education, particularly emphasizing politics, history, and the humanities, which have been under attack for decades now. And we're seeing the dark fruit that we're inevitably going to reap from that. I think another thing that we need to do is have a much more deep and probing conversation about the limitations of some of the new technologies that are being used in democratic societies for political purposes. Twitter is a good example, right? And I'm not saying this as a Luddite, right? I think that technological advances are remarkable, and I hope to see many more of them. But they can also be extremely dangerous, particularly when encouraging one-dimensional forms of political agitation that undermine civic friendship. And we know the president is kind of remarkable for his ability to antagonize people using these new media, right? So those are like several different options I can think of when it comes to renewing civic friendship. But if you don't have that, I think we're going to see people approaching rights from a more and more transactional perspective because they don't see themselves as having any kind of thick obligations to other people. They see life as a zero-sum game where they're going to try to get as much as they can for themselves and those immediately around them. And that's not what we want in our democratic societies. And I don't think it's what any morally right-minded person should want.
Aniruddha, you're coming in here.
Thank you. There's one thing which one comes across very clearly when looking at Western political thought, and which is the emphasis on structures, on institutions. Because the belief is the more and more institutions you have, the less and less you control the badness of humans. But what we forget in the process, that it's the humans. If we are working on humans, then probably we might survive with whatever structure we have. There might be challenges about how we work on humans. Because ultimately, and let's get back to Churchill. Churchill said people get the government they deserve. If the polity is mature enough, the government is going to be mature. Of course, that doesn't mean we don't need institutions at all. I think we have to get out of the extreme views. It's not an either-or scenario. It's always a balance. And in that balance, it is critical to look at how human behavior is, in a sense, modulated in a system which is sustainable for itself as an individual, in that community, maybe as an individual, maybe as a within a family, within a society, within a nation state, and then within a global platform. And while we're trying to conceptualize the existence and behavior of that human being, it's ultimately about incentives. And Matthew spoke about transactional approach, and that transactional approach, good or bad, is a direct consequence of the market capitalism we have adopted. The incentive is finance, is money. But can we think of trying to conceptualize other incentives which might drive individuals in a manner where they're of course conscious about their rights, but at the same time aware of the fact that they are a part of an integrated existence and aware of the need of that balance? How it would function, it's probably for all the philosophers to think a little more on it.
I'd actually just like to respond to that very briefly, if possible, because I think this is actually a nice segue to one of my favorite theoreticians, Amartya Sen, who's an Indian-born economist, winner of the Nobel Prize, particularly for his work on famine. But he interrogated the liberal political tradition that emerged in Western modernity. And he said, one of the big problems you find with it conceptually is its emphasis on what he called transcendental institutionalism, which is that institutions are the only thing that really matters. And I think that's a little bit of a crude characterization. But there is something to that, right? One of the problems Western liberal Democrats have is precisely this fascination with institutions at a transcendental level. And we've forgotten a lot of the stuff that we need to also talk about when it comes to things like culture, civic friendship, how to form meaningful relations with other individual peoples at the psychological level. And I think one of the things that we need to do as intellectuals, if we're going to try to enact some kind of democratic renewal and restore civic friendship in Western states, is precisely to move away from this kind of transcendental institutionalism, not by abandoning it, but by saying there are other complementary factors that are as worthy of attention and haven't gotten the respect from political theorists particularly, or legal theorists for that matter, that they so eminently deserve. So just as a little bit of an academic point.
No, actually, that is a nice segue into some of the questions that we're getting from the audience. And so I hope you don't mind. I'm now going to turn to a few of these questions that are coming through. Matt, one question that's come for you is, how can democratic structures, and it comes back to this point, how can democratic structures be developed in the EU without a shared sense of European identity? How can the EU be a force for rights protection? And Lou's going to come up on this one, I know that, but let's start with Matt.
Well, I think that's an excellent question, right? And it takes us well beyond the purview of this conversation, because I think we'd have to be here all day to try to talk about how to enact democratic renewal in the European Union. But one of the things that's worth noting is that the EU, as it began, in the 1950s, was very much an elite-driven project, right? And there were some very odd metaphysics that underpin it. I often point to Alexander Kojev's End of History thesis, right? Where he talked about how it was that intellectuals were going to construct this international institution that was going to moderate between socialism and liberalism. And people weren't necessarily willing to accept it, but they would, because the dialectic of history was on the Eurocrat side. And this was an extremely arrogant standpoint to take, right? Not to mention a very speculative one. And we're reaping the dark consequences of that now, right? Because a lot of people don't feel a strong association with the European Union. They feel it's a top-down set of institutions that undermine national sovereignty. And since many people now see the nation state as the kind of sole locus for their democratic energies, that's a serious problem. How to enact some kind of stronger sense of attachment to the European Union? Well, I think there's a number of different options that we can take. One is, as I mentioned, education, right? I think that encouraging people to engage with other cultures, to spend some time in other communities, can help to facilitate a stronger sense of association with others in a cosmopolitan fashion. Another thing that I think we can look at is technology. Again, right? Technology can be used, as for instance, Viktor Orban has used it, to stoke differences, or it can be used to encourage complementary discussions, dialogue, and a feeling of togetherness, right? And I think what we need to do is talk about how it is that technological remedies can be put in place to facilitate dialogue from different cultures within the European Union. The other thing that I think is really important is elections, right? So the European Council is well known to be kind of aloof and withdrawn from everyday concerns, even though it runs a lot of the European Union's everyday business. And I think what we need to do is start enacting more democratic procedures to allow people to have more of a say in what's going on at the legal and institutional level. And again, these are all very speculative and kind of not very well thought out on my part, I should say. But I think these are the right kind of ways we can start to approach this problem.
May I speak to this briefly?
Yes, of course, Lou.
Okay, thank you. And so I'm going to partly disagree with our other two panelists about institutions. I think that in a mature democracy, the danger is that institutions become too fossilized, yes, definitely, and become too remote from the people they're supposed to serve. And that case could certainly be made in the US. But I think that in a nascent democracy, the thing that prevents a relapse to bullets over ballots is institutions. Democracies are founded on the basis of party systems, on the basis of other kinds of institutions that enable the democracy to take its first tottering steps away from despotism and or anarchy and towards some kind of stable governance. And it's institutions that help to hold the reins of stability. If the institutions are strong, the democracy can prosper up to a point. Where you have corruption, you have paralysis. And there are all kinds of bureaucracies that are corrupt and therefore paralyzed, or inefficient and therefore paralyzed. Institutions fail. I remember during the Hurricane Katrina, it took the Federal Emergency Management, FEMA, which has a budget of I don't know how many $1 billion. It took them 5 days to get bottled water to a stadium. Okay, there were thousands of people taking refuge in a football stadium in New Orleans, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency couldn't figure out how to get water to them for days on end. It was an utter disgrace. These institutions are supposed to fulfill exactly that kind of mandate, and in a hurry. So if institutions become paralyzed, then they don't work, and everyone's disturbed. On the other hand, look at the failure of the Arab Spring. And the Arab Spring was a movement by a number of vibrant, young, well-educated intellectuals from the Middle East who wanted democratic institutions, yes, who wanted democracy, but they didn't have the institutions on the ground. There was no foundation in those cultures for institutions to arise that were democratic. And that's one of the reasons why the Arab Spring failed. We, as a United States, military power, can go in and change regimes, which we've done, yeah, for good or for ill. But you cannot impose peace on people. You cannot impose democracy on people, and you cannot impose democratic institutions on people. They have to impose those things on themselves. You can't go into Iraq and depose a brutal despot and expect democracy to spring up from nothing. You need those institutions on the ground in order for democracy to take root and flourish. And I'm glad, Matthew, that you mentioned Aristotle. I'm with you on that. We live in an increasingly incivil society because of this failure of this basic virtue of friendship that Aristotle so lauded. And Aristotle also said in his political philosophy that the best and most pleasant states to govern were states with a strong middle class. And our middle class is being bled white. Real wages have declined in the US for 40 years. And as our middle class weakens, so does our goodwill, I'm afraid.
Can I just utter a few sentences, 5?
Yes, Aniruddha, it's going to come straight to you. Go on.
Yeah, thank you very much. Not because I love to take pot shots at the EU once in a while, but on a serious note, I must say, when I look at it, EU, one might say historically it's a nascent structure. It may be a nascent structure, but the way it functions, it's a classical case of what happens when there is excessive institutionalization, when there is excessive bureaucratization. And a classical case is go to a restaurant in Europe, you'll find more footnotes on a restaurant menu than you can find in a lawyer's draft, because there's an EU regulation which says you have to have all sorts of allergies set out on the card. Well, it's good, but it may not function in every part of the European Union. It's a collective. So you simply can't try to bulldoze the will of certain larger countries where most of the bureaucrats come from. And that's where a natural resistance towards such a system comes from. If EU was thought as a set, not as a right, but as a duty towards the smaller states, and if probably the system starts thinking that way, I think the EU might have a brighter future than what seems to be at the moment.
Okay. Thanks, Aniruddha. I want to keep you on because there's a couple of questions that are coming that are directed to you. So just stay on here. One is from Yashoda Mistry, and she's been listening very carefully to you. She said, she's asking, how do we bring out the goodness that is within each human being, as you suggested? Very deep question.
Yes, it's a very deep question. Maybe I should write a book on that. But the first starting point is we need to at least trust people. We are not trusting them to begin with. The whole premise of developing structures is that people are not good. And I have, over the years, come to a notion. I feel law is an anathema to morality. You need law because there is no morality. The more and more laws, less and less morality. So we ideally need to move a situation where we have less and less law and more human behavior. Where if humans are themselves conscious, if I'm conscious about the way I move my wrist, I'm obviously not going to hurt anybody's nose, and there would be minimum need of regulation. Now the issue is how to institutionalize this. If you look at the Indian culture, the whole notion of family, the whole notion of religion, the whole notion of what they call satsang, the meeting of good people, these were different institutional mechanisms which were thought over and over the centuries, whose single objective was to make sure people come together and try to bring out the goodness in them. Kumbh Mela is a classical example. Nowadays, I suppose there are far more facilities, but in the past, there were rarely any facilities. But we don't hear any riots happening there. We see people coming in the most organized fashion, and a huge mass of population, no invitation cards, probably no organization as well. It functions, and it has functioned for centuries. I think what we need to do is pause a bit, go back to this literature, because I'm not saying every single bit of it would be helpful, but there would be some very critical aspects of it which could be thought of, which could be adapted and applied in the modern context. I do realize that I'm giving quite a vague and an abstract answer, but I think that's a project which the lady who has asked the question could probably begin with. And maybe I and other members on the panelists could find some time to reflect on that as well.
Matt, you want to come in there?
Yeah, may I add something to that, which may surprise you, perhaps? But I think I agree, Aniruddha, with your assessment overall. But let me just say, well, we have Matthew, but he's not speaking. So please don't think that he's saying what I'm saying, although he's on the screen.
I do actually have a response to that, right? How to make people good is something that people have been reflecting on now since the dawn of human civilization, right? And I don't think that we're ever going to come up with a firm answer, in part because contexts change and we need to be attentive to that, right? The best answer that I can give with regard to a modern context, I think was actually given by the psychoanalyst Erich Fromm in his book, The Art of Loving, and some other texts on psychoanalytic theory in the mid-20th century, where he said that in an increasingly consumerist society, characteristic of late capitalism, we tend to look at other people only in terms of what we can get from them. And we also tend to look at the state only in terms of what we can get from it, because that's the way we've been primed by the culture around us. And this has a seriously corrosive impact on our ability to form meaningful relations with people. And one of the examples he gave that was very striking in The Art of Loving is that we are gradually losing our capacity to form true friendships and true romantic relations with others, because we don't look at them as individuals who have rich inner lives that are as important as our own. We look at them only in terms of what we can get from them. So I love my friend, not because my friend is someone who is important, but because my friend does things for me. Or I love my girlfriend or my wife, not because she's a strong, independent person who I cherish as an individual, but because she does things for me, right?
Then that goes back to this whole thing that we've become lopsided as a society or a world where rights are dictated more than rights take precedence more over than duty. Is that where you're going with this?
I think actually, no, I'm talking about this at a very psychological level, although it's certainly related to this phenomenon of looking at rights from a purely transactional perspective, right? And one of the points that Fromm makes in his book is that this certainly needs to be changed culturally. It has institutional ramifications, so we need to alter our institutions, but also psychological, right? That people need to learn to start looking at others as beings who have rich inner lives that are as important as their own, and that have something to offer us if we're willing to learn from them. And how to go about inclining people to look at others that way, I don't know, right? I think one of the ways that you can start is by having respectful dialogue with them, right? By genuinely trying to find out what's going on in their head and to appreciate it for its own sake, rather than just trying to instrumentalize it and say, what can I get from you via this conversation? And I think that this is a process that, you know, we need to start inculcating in people from a very early age, right? And I don't think that's the way that we really educate people now. We tend to educate people by saying, you should look at life as a zero-sum game where you try to get as much as you possibly can from other people, most of whom are competition in our highly stratified society, and you want to beat them, right? And if this is the way that we're training people, we shouldn't be surprised when people grow up, pardon my French, to be assholes, right? To only look at one another the way Fromm was describing as means to an end, right?
Right. But may I add something? And I'm not seeing myself on the screen at this point. So again, I'm seeing Matthew. I don't know if you can hear me at all. Can you?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So let me just say this then. What Matthew just finished by saying is what the Jesuits said, give me the child until the age of 7 and I'll answer for the adult. These things are formative. If we teach children to see others only in terms of their race, class, and gender, they'll never see the humanity of the other. They'll never understand it. Their whole worldview will be so discolored with toxic identity politics that they'll never understand that the other could be their friend. But it also depends on enculturation. And Aniruddha, look, the world is not India. India is the world, but the world is not India. And people in the US, it may shock you to learn. I've been teaching Indian philosophy at City College for 20 years, and I have more and more Indian students in my philosophy classes who have been divorced from Indian philosophy because they've been divorced from India and that huge institution of social values that nurtures people there so tenderly and so beautifully and so spiritually. When you come to the West, if you move to New York City, you will, it's like cultural paint stripper. It will basically strip away these things. And expatriates who are born in a different culture will have a much harder time valuing those traditional things and will become much more westernized, and so have to start all over again. Moral education begins in every generation. All right, in science, any idiot can take over where the genius of the previous generation left off, but every human being has to take their own moral and spiritual journey. So it has to start early in life and often in life.
Okay, I'm going to ask Aniruddha to respond to that briefly, but I want to build in another question that's related to this. That's come in from Jamie Smith. And you mentioned moral education. This is a wider question. What role does education, and I guess it's formal education to some extent, play in building a stronger sense of civics, making more responsible citizens, Lou? And then
yes, I mean, in the short answer is, if you replace, as we have in the US very largely across the spectrum, if you replace civics with political indoctrination, you end up with incivility and conflict and civil war, which is what we have in the US. We have a civil war raging now 30 or 40 years, and it's getting worse all the time. COVID did not make it better. Moral education, when we teach ethics, we teach meta-ethics. We teach all kinds of Western ethical systems and Asian ethical systems. We're teaching people that there are many potential answers to the question, what is good, what is right, what is just, but also it's not moral relativism, because we are saying that some answers function better than others in terms of the individual and the society and the polity. So I'm certainly not a moral relativist. And if you want to institute civics, I think it's a very good idea. People should learn where they come from. People should learn the history of where they come from. And it should not be discolored by a political agenda. It should be intellectual history, not political indoctrination. It should be classical philosophy, not political indoctrination. And it should be the great books of the world and not the ones that deconstruct the great books of the world.
Thank you very much, Lou. Aniruddha, if I ask you to respond to that, and then
Yes.
we're going to move to some closing remarks. So we're getting to that point. So Aniruddha, first of all.
Yes, thank you. One of the problems with the education system, the way the Western education system was structured, was, of course, to give knowledge and wisdom. But a great part of it was to train them for the workforce, train humans for the workforce. Now, if you're training humans for a workforce, of course, which is changed and transformed, it's a very crude analysis from the past. Of course, it has transformed over the years. But if the ultimate goal is to prepare somebody for employment, then obviously there is little to expect from the education and little to expect from somebody who is undergoing that education. We'd also need to rethink about fundamentally about the objective of the education system as well. If we have a higher goal, if we are producing good, moral, upright people, inevitably what will come out would be an inevitably good society. So education has an extremely important role. And if we look at the ancient civilizations, education was one of the elementary things. And one of the basic things that the British did when they came to India was to destroy the whole traditional Gurukul system and to bring in the Western education, which basically prepared them for employment, and mostly the employment of a clerk. And till today, we haven't come out of that mentality of the clerk. And therefore, for most of these young people who, when they go to the United States of America and they realize that what they have been taught to is to become a clerk and here is something else, they get stripped of their values. So that's where a part of the problem is. Family is a very critical factor which hasn't been explored fully. And I think Matthew made a very good point about loving. If you can't love the person with whom you are staying with, of course, there are several issues people undergo. But if that's not the basic starting point, let's talk about rights and duties in a family. Until we start looking within a family in the format of a duty, we probably can't think of a sustainable family, we can't think of a sustainable society, and we can't go further sustainable steps from there. So that's a fundamental reorientation which we need to undertake globally. And now, yes, there's a problem with several of us Indians who undergo a certain educational system, go out and forget who we are. But let's not forget, there's a classical example of Swami Vivekananda. Till Swami Vivekananda was in India, nobody knew who he was. The day he gave his speech in America, he became a celebrity, and then Indians started, obviously, yes, Swami Vivekananda is Indian, he speaks of Vedanta, which belongs to us. Why go far? Yoga, for example. We had to be taught back in India, well, yoga is yours, and that's because we as a nation state suffer from a sense of colonized mentality. There's a colonial mentality to make others as a colony. There's a mentality to be colonized yourselves. So we are ourselves colonized in our mind, so we can't assert ourselves. Often people criticize India, why doesn't India take positions on global fora on all issues? Because we still feel that we are the third world, subjugated, harassed entity. We still have to keep screaming. And that's where I think we need to remind ourselves of what Lee Kuan Yew said, the first Prime Minister of Singapore. He wrote a book called From Third World to First World. Unless we develop a mentality of we being ourselves the first world, unless we respect our culture, and which comes from an effort to understand. And I'm confident that if a rational mind sits to study these broad wisdoms, one would realize, well, that's what makes sense. And the reason why it makes sense, there's also a logistical reason. In the West, there has never been a long peace. The peace never lasted more than 100 years, 150 years. There was always a war. The luxury that Indians had, and not just Indians, the Chinese and the rest of the Asians had, there were several hundred years of stability. There were political changes, but the political changes never affected the society. And because the society remained stable, it could nurture, develop, and bring out the goodness. I think we could probably borrow from there in these uncertain and changing times.
May I just respond briefly to this? I think
briefly, and then we're moving into closing remarks. So please, Lou.
All right, closing remarks. All right, let me just say to Aniruddha, I've had the privilege in the last 20 years of working at international conferences with Indian business leaders, Indian entrepreneurs, and Indian ministers. I'd have to say that you're pretty much into a post-colonial mentality by now. And I think that Indian entrepreneurship has been unbelievable. These are not clerks, my friend. The Tata family and the things they've done are just one example of Indian innovation, branding on a global, huge global level. The IT industry and so many other things that go on in India are just unbelievable. But nonetheless, Westernization is cultural paint stripper. Secularization is going to have a dampening effect on the great spiritual traditions of India. So that is definitely something to watch out for. In closing, sure, I just want to reemphasize that democracy is a political experiment and we don't know where it's going. And therefore we don't know where rights and obligations are going either. I'm not a prophet, and Matthew alluded to this and said some other important things too that I want to pick up on in closing. I guess the first one is, you should know that I'm not a prophet either, but I'm someone who has been privileged to have been interconnected with the global community only as a philosopher, not as a multi-billionaire, not as a millionaire, not as an entrepreneur or CEO, but as someone on the values side of the global supply chain and trying always to argue for a more humane form of globalization. In that capacity, I've learned a lot about the world and who runs it and how it's run. And I want to say to you that I predicted Trump's election. It was not a very popular stand to take, but I predicted it. I predicted the Brexit. And it was also a very unpopular stand to take, but I saw the writing on the wall. And I also predicted the fracture and eventual breakup of the EU. And that was back to the other question you had. Look, my friend, the EU succeeded because it temporarily numbed, it anesthetized nationalisms with common currency. And economically, it was by and large a success. When it started to see severe weak links, formerly Greece and Portugal and others, when there were failed states within the EU, it started to fracture. When bailouts didn't work, it started to fracture. And as nationalisms resurge over the immigration question, which is a huge nail in the coffin of the EU, it's also starting to fracture. So I'm not that sanguine about its future. I think nationalisms will be with the world for a lot longer than economic associations will. These transnational things make everybody more competitive in the global market. You want to compete with the USA, you want to compete with China, you want to compete with Japan, you need ASEAN, you need the EU, you need big economic trading blocks to be competitive in this global marketplace. But that doesn't mean that politically they're going to have traction long term, only as far as economics work. Okay, when economics fail, nationalisms will be resurgent. I'm sorry, that sounds like a law of nature. It's almost. So I am optimistic, but always on guard against how the first 7 years of life have affected people's dispositions. If the first 7 years of your life have made you a happy and a good and a compassionate person, then you don't need too many laws and too many police. But if the first 7 years of your life have made you an angry, agitated, greedy person seeking retribution from your society and seeking punishment against others for your own alleged insults, then we need a lot of laws and a lot of police. I'm sorry to say, a human being is what we make of him and her. Let's make something good.
Thank you very much, Lou. Matt, are you feeling optimistic?
I am feeling optimistic in some senses, though. What I want to say for my closing remarks, and I'll relate this back to the earlier question, is I've been fortunate enough to have been teaching in post-secondary education for almost a decade now. And I've encountered many, many young people who are remarkably intelligent, remarkably astute, and very, very depressed, right? And I think one of the reasons they're depressed is they talk a lot about how they're not learning things that really engage their curiosity. They're not invested in the civic community in a meaningful way. And that's because when they look at society and democratic 21st century society, they see a competitive association that's liberal in name only, not spirit, because you're supposed to look at everyone and everything from a purely instrumentalist standpoint, whether that be your education or other individuals. And I don't think a society that's predicated on this logic can be sustainable in the long term. And I think we're seeing a lot of the consequences of this kind of hyper-competitive stratification coming to the fore right now, when people are looking for sources of connection, whether that be nationalism or return to traditionalism, or even a return to various forms of religious life. And some of these are beneficial and some of them most certainly are not. But what I think we need to recognize is that we're in a period of transition and things are not set. What we want to do is move the world in a more rights-respecting direction where we renew civic friendship and we renew democracy, not one where we start to fixate on the things that divide us, which is the risk that we very seriously run today.
Thank you very much, Matt. And Aniruddha, your closing comments.
Thank you very much. In conclusion, I think what one needs to keep in mind is rights as encapsulated by the law have a fundamental limitation. They will always have a limitation. And one can imagine very few things because rights by themselves in a constant evolutionary process. The challenges are going to change, the expectations are going to change. And as these keep on unfolding, the nature of rights is inevitably going to change. And if we wait for the state to recognize a right, then we are losing out on a lot of things. So there is a lot more ground to cover on the basis of morality, on the basis of moral training, on the basis of moral consciousness and awareness. And that's what we need to be looking at as a society for a sustainable world. Thank you.
And thank you, Aniruddha, for those concluding remarks as well. Look, I promised everybody at the beginning of this session that it's going to be, we're not going to disappoint, and certainly our three speakers have not disappointed us. It's been a sheer festival of ideas, some great imaginative thoughts. Yes, there are challenges that we have in the world, but I think each one of you ended up with something that's optimistic about the world and the future that holds for us. And clearly at a very personal level, and I know a lot of the audience here would also recognize one of the threads that was coming out of this is that Indian philosophy, ancient thoughts, there's a room for a better understanding of these thoughts, and perhaps could form the basis of a new dialogue, a fresher dialogue, not only about the rejuvenation of multilateral institutions, but the wider debate, the ideological debate about how rights of citizens are balanced against the duties of citizens and how they would flow from one to another. So it's been a fascinating discussion. In normal circumstances, I would, of course, ask the audience to share a round of applause for each one of you, but we'll have a virtual round of applause and me thanking each one of you. So thank you ever so much, Professor Matt McManus, Professor Lou Marinoff, and my dear friend, Dr. Aniruddha Rajput. Thank you very much for your excellent insights. It's something that you've left a lot of food for thought for all of our audience, and I'm sure these comments will be referred to in the days and weeks to come as well. My thanks once again to the entire team at Vichar Manthan. I know this is the concluding session, and again, I hope we haven't disappointed in any way. So congratulations to Vichar Manthan and your entire team. So over and out from me, and over now to Nakul. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Manoj and our panelists for sharing and exploring. Thank you very much to Manoj and our panelists for sharing and exploring the nuances surrounding human rights and duties. Thank you to you, our virtual audience, for joining us. We hope you will continue the Manthan in your own circles. If you would like to learn more about Vichar Manthan or support us by investing in ideas that matter, please visit vicharmanthan.org or click on the links below this video. We now have the closing address of our Sustainable Narratives Conference, titled Sustainable Futures, delivered by Vichar Manthan Fellows Rajashekar Asireddy and Sumit Sharma. Rajashekar is coordinator for Sustainable Narratives Conference 2020, and also our first full-time VM Vistarak for a year. By profession, Rajashekar is a senior IT manager, responsible for strategy and delivery. Currently on sabbatical for a year, he has dedicated his time to VM to expand the chapter work, book clubs, and also help in setting up the foundation and think tank. Over to you, Rajashekar ji.
Namaste. Thank you for joining our first virtual conference, Sustainable Narratives 2020, covering the 5 major branches of society: governance, politics, economics, religion, and civics. In these 4 days, we had 5 panel discussions and 8 fireside conversations with 24 world-renowned expert witnesses. The conference explored some pertinent questions which humanity is facing. from the role of institutions to governing models, postmodernism, nationalism, institutionalizing religion, sustainable economy, rights and duties, and many more ideas were discussed. We challenged many assumptions, and many new ideas were proposed in these discussions. I would like to thank all our panelists who joined from across the world, who were able to give their time voluntarily to contribute to our exploration of ideas. I would like to thank the Earth Foundation, which is an organization that looks to support platforms which are exploring pertinent ideas, institutions which are working with leading lights, and also research fellows who are working on sustainable solutions. I would also like to thank the Center for Sustainability, which is a platform that brings leading lights together who can collaborate and generate sustainable ideas for the future. The conference is all about sustainability and ideas. Why ideas? Without them, there is no progress. There is no change. There is no human development. Ideas are the most powerful things in human life. And sustainability is that which takes us closer to the truth. We are here to continue to explore sustainable ideas. By now, you should have an understanding what Vichar Manthan is all about. For those who do not know, we are the vanguard of sustainable ideas, exploring the issues society facing through a Hindu civilizational lens. We are a Hindu platform for earnest thinkers. We are a voluntary organization completely run by volunteers investing their own time and money. This story started 10 years ago with 5 pioneers who thought there is a need for this sort of a platform in society. This has grown manyfold. Now we have 35 volunteers, 4 VM chapters, as well as 6 book clubs across the country, where people come together on a weekly basis to explore and discuss ideas. If you want to know more, please visit our website. There is a link in the description. What you have seen in the past 4 days is the effort of our last 10 years. A number of volunteers have spent countless hours building this platform, engaging with expert witnesses, and exploring various topics. Allow me to explain what the next 10 years may look like for Vichar Manthan. We aim to have VM chapters around the world at every location, which is a hub for ideas. New York, Los Angeles, Paris, Berlin, Rome, Tokyo, New Delhi, and any center which has institutions exploring ideas. At these centers, we aim to champion sustainable ideas. If this appeals to you, if what you have experienced has touched you, and you would like to be part of this story, please get in touch with us and become a volunteer. To bring together 24 leading lights from around the world onto one platform to discuss sustainable ideas has not only been a joy, but also a groundbreaking experience, personally for me. Now I want you to imagine what 50 or even 100 leading lights on this platform would look like. How rich in ideas would these conferences would be? How much benefit would they provide to society? We can only do these conferences if and when institutions which are like-minded and earnest come together and join us in our mission. This is a call for academics, writers, and thought leaders who have found this conference refreshing and earnest. If I'm talking to you, then this is a home for you. Come and join us. Help us to create the future. As we have heard in this conference, there is no shortage of wealth in this world. The question is, how much of that wealth is dedicated to solving the problems of humanity in a sustainable way? I would say not enough. We invite all of you who have enjoyed this conference and have been fortunate to have accumulated enough wealth for you and your family to now extend your generosity to institutions, platforms, and individuals who are trying to solve the biggest problems facing humanity. Until and unless this happens, we will not be able to confront the challenges we face as a society. Do get in touch with us to invest in ideas that matter. Once again, I am delighted that this conference was successful, and I wanted to thank each of you, including our well-wishers and those who have donated, to have made this happen. Now I want to hand over to my colleague, Sumit Sharma, who heads up our London chapter. Namaste. Over to you, Sumit ji.
Namaste, and thank you, Rajashekar ji. The future belongs to those who make it. With uncertainty rife, what world will you leave behind? Thanks to Rajashekar ji and the entire Vicharamanthan team, who over the last 4 days have helped us understand what sustainable means, to uphold, to be progressive. Do we really, though, understand what narratives mean? I think it would be naive to think they are just stories we talk about the future. 100 years from now, how will we behave? Will we be able to govern ourselves? And what about that ever inert challenge of disseminating power? If we are living better today, will we continue to do so? When you clicked on YouTube this morning or across the last 4 days, that wasn't such a simple process. That was as iconic as lighting a diya or cutting a ribbon. The inauguration of intellectual prowess, where Vicharamanthan is that catalyst for change. And the very bastions, those 24 plus speakers who helped us churn, dissect, and understand ideas that permeate through society, who helped us put ideas on the dock to see if they can stand the test in the light of sustainability. My thanks to those leading lights who have only just begun to show us the snippets of future contributions. Now, a project like this doesn't happen overnight. And through this COVID pandemic, I am humbled and privileged to be part of a 25 plus strong team of volunteers from across the UK, from our study groups and our book clubs, who have been able to put this extended weekend together. Over the last 7 weeks, we put in over 5,000 man hours. I'm proud, and I hope that we have begun to understand how important ideas are. I hope that we can understand how critical we must be and how it is we can influence the future. But why? And to what end? Of course, it's for the greater good, and it's for us all. It's a very popular Hindi saying, Sabka Vikas, Sabke Saath, which asks for the evolution, which asks for the flourishing so that we can uplift humanity. And that is just the beginning. It's just the start. This weekend, we have just begun, just taken the first steps. We also want to thank you at home, the audience, the over 1,000 plus registrations, and so far the latest numbers show that over 10,000 plus views we have had. Those of you we thank for tuning in, for listening, for hearing, for sharing your comments and enriching the dialogue with us. It takes 4 main ingredients for an idea to sustain. Money, time, people, and institutions. And I promise you, you have contributions. They matter. If there was any idea or manthan or fireside chat that you heard this weekend that rang true for you, that made you think twice, or that you were able to connect with, then I urge you, we need to expand this network. We need to invest in ideas. Once COVID is over, we'll have a festival of ideas. I hope you too can join one of our Vichar Manthans or our book clubs or one of our study groups. Lots of information on our website. I urge you to have a look. I also think it's apt and fitting that on this auspicious day in the Hindu calendar of Guru Purnima, where collectively millions of people are seeking to dispel darkness and move towards the light. Together, let us step out of our comfort zone. Let us challenge the narratives in society and continue the dialogue. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sumit Sharma. This was Vichar Manthan, Sustainable Narratives Conference 2020. Namaste.